1,200 feet over Seattle, Eddie Allen keys his radio and says the words no test pilot ever wants to say. The wing is on fire. Not the engine, the wing itself. Inside it, magnesium is burning at more than 5,000 degrees, hot enough to melt the spar that holds the wing to the airplane. No water, no foam, no prayer on earth can put it out. Allen is the finest test pilot in America. An insurance company once refused to cover these flights unless he was the man in the seat. He has 9 minutes to live. And here's the part almost nobody knows. The secret bomber killing Eddie Allen right now is the most expensive weapon the United States will build in the entire Second World War. Not the atomic bomb. This bomber. $3 billion, a full billion more than the Manhattan Project. And 1 year from now, America will be forced to fight a desperate, round-the-clock battle just to keep this machine alive. Not over Germany, not over Japan, in the frozen middle of Kansas. That battle will hinge on one furious general, one impossible deadline, and a one-word answer that nearly sank the entire program. By the end of this story, you'll know what that word was and why it was spoken. You'll also know why the people who finally won the Battle of Kansas were teenagers, farmers, and housewives standing in the snow. They're not who you'd expect, and what they pulled off in 6 weeks still sounds impossible. But first, you need to understand why the airplane was worth dying for. It's February 18, 1943. The aircraft burning over Seattle is the second prototype of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, so secret that most of the men building its parts don't know what it is. On paper, it's a machine from the future. Pressurized, so crews can breathe without masks. Guns aimed by early computers. It flies farther, higher, and heavier than anything on the planet. America needs it for one brutally simple reason. Japan is out of reach. The B-17s pounding Germany simply cannot cross the Pacific distances, strike Japan, and come home. The B-29 can. Which is why Washington has bet $3 billion on it before it even works. And it does not work. At 12:26 p.m., Eddie Allen's burning bomber clips power lines, misses downtown Seattle by a mercy, and smashes into the Frye meatpacking plant. 5,000 gallons of gasoline turn the building into a furnace. Everyone aboard dies. So do about 20 workers inside the plant, and a young firefighter named Luther Bonner, who ran toward the flames. Moments before impact, radio operator Harry Ralston got out one final transmission. "Allen, better get this thing down in a hurry. The wing spar is burning badly." That single sentence is the whole B-29 problem in miniature, because the fire didn't start in the wing. It started in the engine, the Wright R-3350, the most powerful aircraft engine America had ever mass-produced. 18 cylinders, 2,200 horsepower, and a fatal flaw. To save weight, its builders used magnesium in key components. The engine ran hot, starved of cooling air, prone to swallowing its own valves. When it caught fire, and it kept catching fire, the magnesium ignited, and the blaze could chew through a wing spar in seconds. So here's the grim irony hanging over the entire program. The airplane designed to burn down Japan's war industry kept setting itself on fire. Now, you'd think a machine that just killed its best test pilot and 30 other people would be paused or rethought from scratch. Instead, 9 months later, the President of the United States personally raised the stakes. November 1943, the Cairo Conference. Franklin Roosevelt sits across from Chiang Kai-shek, leader of a China that has been bleeding under Japanese occupation for 6 years, and that Washington fears might collapse out of the war entirely. So Roosevelt makes a promise. B-29s, flying from bases in China, will be bombing Japan itself by the spring of 1944. There is just one problem with that promise. The bombers don't exist. Not really. Oh, they're rolling out of the factories. The giant Boeing plant in Wichita, Kansas, is pushing them out the doors. But rolling out of a factory and being ready for war are two very different things. Every airplane comes off the line riddled with defects, missing equipment, waiting on fixes that pile up faster than anyone can track. The design is sound, the execution is chaos. The man now trapped between the promise and the chaos is General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, a man so consumed by this war that his own heart is failing him. He'll suffer multiple heart attacks before it's over. Arnold has done the math. To keep Roosevelt's word, he needs at least 175 combat-ready superfortresses. On January 11, 1944, Arnold flies to Wichita to see them for himself. He walks the assembly line, and he likes what he sees. He hunts down the 175th Fuselage, stops beside it, and tells the plant manager, "This is the airplane I want, and I want it before the 1st of March. Then he signs his name directly on the metal. It's a great story. It's also a trap, and Arnold is setting it for himself. Because a signature on a fuselage is not a combat-ready bomber, and not one person on that factory floor has the nerve to tell the most feared general in the Air Forces what the real numbers look like. Here they are. By mid-January 1944, 97 B-29s have been built at Wichita. Of those 97, exactly 16 can fly at all. The number ready for combat is 0. Which brings us to the moment this entire story has been circling. March 9, 1944. Arnold returns to Kansas, to Smoky Hill Army Airfield near Salina, expecting to watch the 58th Bombardment Wing lift off for India. The deadline he promised the president is weeks away. He steps onto the flight line, looks at the rows of silver bombers, and asks how many of them can leave for India tomorrow as ordered. The answer is one word. None. Not half, not a handful, none. After the billions of dollars, the promise to two world leaders, the signature drawing on that fuselage, not one single B-29 is ready to go to war. What happens next passes into legend. Arnold detonates. A reporter who pieced the scene together wrote that he exploded a string of impossible orders that set phones jangling all over the country. He demands to know who is responsible, and the most frightening answer of all comes back. No one is. The failure isn't one man. It's a dozen factories, 100 subcontractors, and thousands of unfinished modifications with no one in charge of the whole picture. So Arnold reaches for a fixer, Major General Bennett Myers, a ruthless troubleshooter history would later disgrace, convicted of perjury after the war. But in March 1944, ruthless is exactly what's required. Arnold hands him authority to act in Arnold's own name. Myers lays down 3 rules. No paperwork beyond quick notes, working hours as long as a man can stand on his feet, and the last airplane flies by April 15th. 37 days, 150 bombers. That is the Battle of Kansas. And here's where the generals step out of this story and the real heroes step in. Because you can't fix a bomber with an order, you fix it with hands. And the enemy waiting for those hands wasn't Japanese, it was the Kansas winter. Boeing pulled 600 workers straight off the Wichita production line and threw them at the airfields at Salina, Pratt, Great Bend, and Walker. Mechanics flew in from across the country until more than 1,000 technicians crowded the flight lines. And there was almost nowhere to put them, because barely any hangar in Kansas could swallow a bomber with a 141-foot wingspan. So the work happened outside, in the open, in February and March, on the high plains. Picture what that actually meant. temperatures swinging from 20 degrees above zero to 2 below. Snowstorms rolling in off the prairie. Wind that one account said hissed with sleet, tearing loose engine cowlings off their fittings and sailing them across the field. The workers were issued high-altitude flying suits, clothing designed for 30,000 feet just to survive on the ground. In that cold, fingers go numb in minutes and metal freezes to bare skin. So the men and women worked in shifts of roughly 20 minutes of precision labor, then a sprint to a gasoline heater to thaw their hands, then back into the wind. Around the clock, under floodlights at 3 in the morning. And the work itself was almost beyond belief. They pulled the fire-prone engines out of brand-new bombers and rebuilt them by hand to a new war engine standard. Better cooling baffles, tougher valves, improved oil flow. They reworked the cowl flaps so the engines could finally breathe. Pilots had complained the cockpit glass was so distorted they had to move their heads from pane to pane just to see straight, so crews replaced the glass on 75 aircraft. New rudders, strengthened wings, reinforced landing gear, radar sets, extra fuel tanks bolted into bomb bays. Some individual airplanes needed more than 50 separate major modifications. But one job dwarfed all the others. Each B-29 carried miles of electrical wiring, joined by connectors that vibrated loose and failed in flight. The fix was medieval in its simplicity. Open every connector, resolder it, close it again. One at a time, in the freezing wind. The final count of connections rebuilt across the fleet came to roughly 586,000, about 40,000 hours of labor for that single task. And the people who did it were not just soldiers. At its peak, the Wichita plant employed nearly 30,000 people, and about 2 out of every 5 were women. Farmers, teachers, taxi drivers. One of them was Connie Palacios, a Mexican-American girl who walked into Boeing at 17 and learned to drive rivets into B-29 nose sections. Decades later, some of those airplanes were still flying, still held together by her rivets. Asked about it near the end of her long life, she said simply, "Well, I was just doing my job." Plane by frozen plane, the job got done. On the morning of March 26, 1944, a Superfortress named Gone with the Wind lifted off from Pratt with Colonel Leonard Harmon at the controls. She turned east toward a ferry route of more than 11,500 miles. Newfoundland, Marrakesh, Cairo, Karachi. 7 days later, on April 2nd, Harmon set her down at Chakulia, India. The first one had made it. But don't let anyone tell you this ends clean. By the April 15th deadline, only 32 bombers had actually reached India. The ferry route turned lethal. A total wreck at Marrakesh, fatal crashes at Karachi, the entire route grounded for over a week. Of the original 150 aircraft, 5 were destroyed and 4 badly damaged before dropping a single bomb. Arnold himself admitted, in a letter that April, that the operation got off to a bad start due to late production schedules, difficult modifications, inclement weather, and the sheer pressure of time. The combat debut was just as humbling. On June 5, 1944, 98 Superfortresses took off from India against the rail yards at Bangkok. At more than 2,200 miles, it was the longest bombing mission ever flown to that point. Only 77 reached the target. The bombing was scattered. 5 bombers crashed on landing. The enemy never fired a shot. The airplane was still its own worst enemy. And when the B-29 finally struck Japan on the night of June 15, 1944, hitting the Iwata steelworks, the physical damage was almost nothing. Those were the first bombs on the Japanese homeland since the Doolittle raid 2 years earlier. Fewer than half the bombers found the target. Photographs later showed a single bomb anywhere near the steel plant. That leaves the hard question of whether the Battle of Kansas was worth it. Here's the honest answer. The China campaign it fed was a logistical nightmare, with every gallon of fuel flown over the Himalayas, and it was quietly abandoned within a year. But those 6 frozen weeks in Kansas did something bigger than one campaign. They turned a fragile, self-igniting prototype into a weapon that actually worked, and they taught America how to keep it working. When the superfortresses later rose by the hundreds from the Mariana Islands, every one of them was the descendant of the machines dragged into life on those iced-over Kansas runways. Those were the raids that broke Japan's war industry, and 2 of those aircraft carried atomic bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hap Arnold put it bluntly. He compared the Battle of Kansas, in importance, to Stalingrad. When it was over, he stood before the workers and said, "Well done, and thanks from the bottom of my heart." Eddie Allen never saw any of it. He spent his last 9 minutes fighting a burning wing away from a city, flying a machine that wasn't ready, and he never learned that it would be saved. Not by generals, not by engineers in warm offices, by ordinary people standing in the snow at 3 in the morning, thawing their hands over gasoline heaters so they could go back and fix one more connection. There's no beach named after them, no monument on a hill. Just a fleet of bombers that flew because they refused to quit, and a battle fought in Kansas that helped end a world war.